Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be sketching a scene in a city called Innsbruck, Austria, using these Derwent watercolor pencils. So I've had these for quite some time now, but I always choose to use normal watercolor instead of them, so I haven't really used them much so far. So this set comes in a very nice metal box with 36 watercolor pencils in it. And I actually bought this because I have always loved using color pencils since I was a young girl. And I went through many coloring books as a child, but although I have used watercolor pencils before, I always used them as normal color pencils and never really activated them with water to make them look like watercolor paintings. So today I'm going to have some fun and try to fully utilize these watercolor pencils. I will be using this paper from Bao Hong. It is 100% cotton, acid-free, 300 GSM, and it's hot pressed. So it's quite a smooth paper and not a lot of texture on it. This is a Pentel water brush, so I'll be using that later. And this is the reference photo that I'll be using. It is a photo that I took in Innsbruck of these spring flowers. I think they were just planted by someone, and it was early spring when I visited Innsbruck. And it was such a beautiful place. So I will upload the reference photo on my Ko-fi page. So if you want to, you can go there and download it. And I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who has bought me coffees and bought my coloring pages. Your support it means a lot to me. It enables me to create more content, so I want to say thank you so much. You guys are awesome. So right here I'm starting with the orange yellow color for two of the big red flowers at the bottom. I think they are poppy flowers. Do correct me if I'm wrong. So I'm just doing a very rough sketch. I'm trying to map out where the petals are, and then I'm blocking in some color. And the most important thing is you need to try and use different pressures. Don't use like one pressure for everything and just try to block in like a solid one color. Try to use light pressure to get lighter areas, and then use more pressure for the darker areas where there should be shadows. So you can also do multiple layers to darken certain areas and add more color. Next, I'm using this pink color for those pink daisies, those little flowers, and they have really tiny little petals, so each stroke is indicative of one single petal. And each flower is a little bit different. Don't draw them in the same size, in the same orientation. Make some a little bigger or a little smaller. Some of them are closer together and some of them are further away. And if you haven't already noticed, I am leaving the center of these white. I'm leaving them uncolored, so later I'll come in with a yellow color and I will color in those centers. So at this point, I'm not taking too much time with each flower. I'm just adding that first layer, and we will gradually add more layers and different colors to them later. So now I am using the lemon color for some yellow flowers. Again, I'm varying up the sizes of the flowers. And I'm using that same yellow for the middle part of the pink flowers. And at the same time, I'm bringing that yellow into the big red flowers. So now I'm using the orange yellow for some smaller orange flowers. And to me, it's okay if those shapes that you make are kind of impressionistic or kind of irregular. It doesn't really matter, especially at this first stage. I like having flowers that are sort of impressionistic as well. Next, I'm using that violet color to draw these little spots, which are actually the centers of the flowers. So these flowers, they are mostly white in color with purple centers. So if you want to have something white in color at the end, you need to remember that you need to preserve the white color of the paper. So don't color over it with any color at all. Try to preserve that. It's kind of like a negative painting. So you'll see that later on. So just like before, I am using that same violet color and bringing it into the other flowers, even though they are not purple or violet. So now I'm coming in with that red color to give those big red flowers more red. And I'm trying to use more pressure for more punch in those areas that are more saturated. So with watercolor pencils, the way that you add depth and the way that you add more interest is to add more layers. And it's not necessarily in the same color. You can see I used orange before, and then there is a little bit of yellow, and now I'm using red. Later on, I will be using different colors for the shadows as well, so that will help to add depth to your drawing. It's also good to keep in mind that at this point it may look like the colors are quite light, but once you activate them with watercolor, they will become darker and more saturated. So now I'm starting to add shadows with that purple color, and I'm going to use this purple color a lot later for all the shadows, not just in like those red flowers. It was raining really heavily when I was drawing this little scene, so staying indoors and sketching someplace sunny was really cozy and therapeutic for me. Next, I'm introducing a new color, a very different color, which is the bright blue for those little blue flowers at the top. So these are, I think, what people call forget-me-nots, and they are really cute. They're really pretty and very small, but they have a real big punch when they are in one group together. So try to get as usual, try to get some of these dots, these flowers, closer together. Some of them are further apart. You may think they are random, but actually there is a bit of order to it. So try to just capture what you see in the reference photo and not to go too crazy. Just you can see that those little flowers at the top, they are kind of more together, they are closer together. So try to capture that in your drawing. As you can see, I'm adding some of those purple dots, and I'm hoping actually to mix those blend those two colors together later with water so that they create this bluish purple color, which is more towards what I'm looking for. The bright blue is actually a little bit too blue for me. So yeah, that's why I added some purple. And now we are moving on to the greens, and I am basically filling up all those spaces between the flowers. And I'm starting with olive green, and I'm sketching those bigger stalks and leaves that I see in the photo. So it doesn't have to be exactly like the photo, but you should have elements that look like the photo. And you have to try to make it seem like there are leaves and stalks, but don't try to copy the photo exactly. That's what I'm trying to say. As long as you give the viewer an impression of those leaves and stalks, then you're good. So when you allow yourself to suggest details instead of explaining everything, then your sketch becomes like a conversation between you and the viewer. And the things that you left unsaid, that viewer will fill in the blanks themselves. And that is what is interesting about impressionistic painting or drawing. It just leaves room for the viewer to have their own interpretation. Next, I'm using dark coffee for the garden box, and dark coffee is the name of the color, right? So I'm shading in this part really carefully, and I'm trying to avoid the flowers and also the leaves that I drew in before. Now I'm using the same purple that we used before to layer over that dark coffee layer, and also to create some shadows. So for this piece, I will use a combination of a few colors. One is the dark coffee, second is the purple, and later on there will be blue for shadows. So right now I'm using the dark coffee in other areas besides the garden box. So I'm introducing that color to other areas as well, and it is acting as to deepen those colors. So at this point, I was pretty happy with how things were coming together. So I decided that I wanted to start activating the pigments. even though it does look like there is not enough shadow in certain areas yet, not enough contrast. But the thing you can keep in mind is that you can always add more layers later after that water has dried. So it is quite flexible. You can start activating earlier on and then add more layers later. So yeah, that's up to you to decide. So you can see really clearly that as soon as those pigments are activated, they become so much more saturated and stronger. But the strokes that you made with the color pencil are still visible to some extent. So it is a different aesthetic from normal watercolors, and I quite like that aesthetic. It looks very interesting to me. These pigments, they don't really behave much like watercolor, and they don't move around much on the paper, and they don't blend much with each other. They do blend a little bit, but not much. Make sure you also paint around the flowers carefully, especially those white purple flowers. So it's sort of like what I mentioned before, negative painting. So the background is what defines the shape of those flowers. And all the other flowers, even though they are not white, you also have to preserve their shape because they are very light in color. And this pigment is actually not so forgiving as watercolor because it is quite hard to lift the pigment or the paint off the paper. So it's hard to correct mistakes actually. And so you do have to be a little bit more careful. So once that has dried, I'm coming in with this cobalt blue for some of those darker shadows. And I'm always referring back to the reference and trying to find all those darker areas so that I can define this painting, this drawing even more. So once I was happy with all the additional layers of color, I then started to activate the paint yet again. And now I'm getting more contrast and more shadows. So this painting slash drawing is becoming more defined. Alright, so we're finally done with that flower bed, and I think it came together quite nicely. It has just enough detail, but it is still loose and fun too. So the main subject of this piece is definitely that flower bed and those flowers. So the second half of this sketch will be about sketching that background, and I'm going to try to use lighter colors and not have too much detail in that background. So right now I'm just doing a very simple building right there. I used a medium yellow to draw a very simple square, and then I drew in that roof with dark coffee and also garnet red. Right now I just drew in that line across, and it is actually indicating the wall beside the river. And I'm drawing in these lines which are indicative of flags. So next I'm adding in bright blue for the windows, and I also add some orange to give some color and more layers to that building. Now I'm adding a little bit of red to indicate those flags, and I'm also starting to add in some of those trees. I'm really trying to not be too accurate. I'm trying to be loose and not to define too many things, and I'm not trying to get it too complicated. But it's quite easy actually to get a bit carried away when you're coloring like this. At least it is for me. So I added quite a lot of layers to that background right there. So looking back, I think maybe I should have been a little more subtle, and just really add really a little bit of color would have been enough. If it was normal watercolor, I would have gone with a very light wash, and that would be fine. But I got a little bit carried away, as you can get when you do these watercolor sketches, and when you color in coloring pages, you just go a little bit nuts sometimes, and by the time you realize, like, oh, I probably should have done less, it's a little bit too late, because, well, these color pencils are quite permanent, and as I said before, mistakes are hard to correct, especially if you compare it to like watercolors or gouache or acrylic, and those mediums are a little bit more forgiving actually. So but yeah, as you can see right here, I'm starting to realize after I've activated those pigments that wow, it's so saturated and so eye-catching, completely not what I am looking for in a background. But it depends on what you want. Like maybe that color, that beautiful saturated color, is something that you like, then that is fine, right? But for me, I wanted something more subtle. So later on, I will be adding layers of brown coffee, dark coffee, to sort of dull that super saturated green down a little bit. Alright, so now you can see very clearly that even though I'm really rubbing that pigment, none of it is coming off anymore. Like it has set completely, and so that is one of the very different qualities as compared to watercolor. Once you have activated that pigment, it is quite hard to change it. It's quite hard to lift it. So, but you know, mistakes are just happy accidents, right? So yeah, I'm going to try to correct those things later, so you can see how I do it later. So as you can see, I used more than half of those 36 watercolor pencils for just this one drawing. And actually, I think I could use so many of those colors and it would be fine. Not like with watercolor paints. I try to limit my paints, not to use too many different paints at once in one painting. But that is because you can mix colors with watercolor paints, and you can't do that with pencils. So yeah, you can really go through like a lot of these watercolor pencils when you are like sketching something like this. So now I'm activating that pigment yet again. So this is a constant repeat of that two-step process, which is to put down those strokes and then to activate it with water after that. But so it does take a little bit more time than normal painting does. But these pencils are great for detail work and adding texture and depth to your artwork. So I can see myself really using these more in the future for adding some texture to my watercolor paintings or making these kinds of sketches. Another thing about these pencils is that even though they look like pastel or crayon, it doesn't smudge, and it is surprisingly very permanent and very staining. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you found it helpful, please do like, comment, and subscribe. I would love to hear your comments about this sketch, and maybe if you have any ideas for future videos, please do comment down below. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next one.